Chapter 17. Amelia. It's been days since what transpired between Damien and me, and it's been easier to convince myself that what happened was just a mistake, that I had gotten caught up in the moment and it had made me act the way I did. These are the words I have used to repeatedly convince myself for the past few days. That it had happened due to the heat of the moment and nothing else. I mean, there is no other reason to explain why I had acted the way I did, why I had felt the need to kiss him as some sort of comfort to him at the moment. Enough. Enough, Amelia. My inner screamed inside. Shaking the thoughts off my mind, I decided to distract myself with something else, like the beauty of the fountain or something. I knew I would find you here. A voice spoke up and turned to see Lucas walking towards me with a pure smile on his face. I smiled back weakly in response. Are you okay? He asked. I nodded, just a little tired, but I will be fine, I said, assuring him with a smile. He stepped closer and sat beside me. Silence surrounded us for a while before he decided to speak up again. Amelia, I can't pretend I understand how you feel. Surely being a surrogate is not an easy task. He reached out and placed his hand over mine. But you're not alone in this. I pulled my hand from his. Thanks, Lucas, that means a lot, I said. No one can possibly understand what I am going through. He got up and stretched out his hand to me. There's something I would like to show you, he said. Ignoring it, I stood up on my own, leaving a distance between us. What is it you want to show me? I asked. It's surprised, he said, reaching out and taking my hand in his. Trust me, he whispered. I nodded and followed him out the house to his car. A few minutes later, the car came to a halt. I looked around in awe. It's a beach. I hopped out of the car. It's a private beach, owned by the Greys, he said as he came around the other side and stood next to me. I don't think they remember it still exists, he muttered. We came here a lot as kids when we needed to hide away from our various responsibilities, he said as we walked towards the beach. Beautiful, I smiled. Indeed. I looked up at him and realized he was staring at me instead of the beach. I cleared my throat. Why did you bring me here, Lucas? I asked, continuing the walk. I needed to show you that the Greys aren't as terrible as they are rumored to be, especially Damien. He's been through a lot. He paused. Do you know he had a sister? He asked. I shook my head. I assumed he's the only child. He scoffed. As usual, Mrs. Grey did an excellent job in covering up that story. He paused. Her name was Elena Grey. She was murdered in their old house in Spain when she was 15, and since that day Damien's life has been one mysterious pile of threats to another, and he's been strong in fighting through all of it until the recent one, which completely broke him apart, he said as we stopped. Are you saying his accident wasn't an accident, after all, but an attempt by someone on his life? I asked, still in disbelief. Yes, he answered sadly. My jaw dropped. That's terrible, I let out. I shook my head after a while, confused. Wait. Why are you telling me this? He took his eyes down to my stomach. Because, I believe this child might actually be the hope Damien needs to rise up again. I huffed, looking out the ocean. He said he doesn't want it. I spoke up after a while. He chuckled. That does sound like something he would say. He paused. After Elena died, the rest of his family pretty much blamed him for her death, making him grow cold towards everyone, and in the process, he developed this crazy conception that anyone who gets close to him is bound to be destroyed or worse, killed. He said, he blames himself for her death every day. I took my eyes back to him. How's Elena's death his fault? I thought you said she was killed. I covered my mouth in realization. Did he kill her? I asked in horror. No one knows what exactly happened that night. Damien won't say, but I am sure of one thing. Chapter 18. Amelia. Sue, how was your date? Nina giggled as she jumped on the bed next to me. I threw her a playful glare. It wasn't a date, we just strolled on the beach and talked about random things. Duh, that's an exact definition of a date, Amelia, she said before her voice turned mischievous. So did you two make out or what? She asked, and I shook my head. You're impossible, I shot playfully. She grinned. Fine. Don't tell me, I will definitely find out myself, she said, leaning her head back against the bed and looking up at the ceiling. I did the same. We were surrounded by a little silence before I decided to speak up again. He told me about Elena? Silence. What did he say? She asked after a while. I shook my head slightly. Nothing really. Just how everyone blamed Damien for her death. I mean, could he have killed his own sister? She sighed heavily. Well, that story is still a mystery to everyone, and I would stop talking about if I were you. She said, getting down from the bed. Come on, let's go get you something to eat. She said. I couldn't help but feel there's a lot she isn't saying. I nodded and followed her out the door. We came down the stairs, and just as we were about turning towards the kitchen, the front door opened. I stood still and watched as a lady dressed in an elegant black dress walked in. Nina snorted in disgust. The bitch is back. She said, making me take my eyes to her. Who's she? Kim. She spat before heading towards the kitchen, leaving me standing there alone. She's beautiful. She stepped further with 4 suited men following her behind like their lives depended on protecting her. She looks free and fearless, you. She spoke up and took me a while before I realized she was referring to me. Me. I stuttered like a fool. She rolled her eyes. Come with me. He ordered nonchalantly. I gasped and followed her behind as she began climbing up the stairs towards Damien's room. We got to his door, and surprisingly she sucked in a deep breath before pushing the door open. She entered and I followed her behind like Poppy and stood at the corner of the room. The rest I could handle but his room. There are too many memories of how badly my life has turned around. My eyes landed on Damien. He was longing on a window seat with an earplug plugged into his ear. Damien. Kim whispered, but you could sense the tremor in her voice. At her words he turned towards our direction. Kim? Yes. She answered and made her towards him, closing the distance between them by hooping onto his laps. How are you feeling? She asked. Concern was plain in her voice. Blind. He shot back bitterly. And alive. That's good, hun. She replied dryly. I am assuming you're here for the commemoration tomorrow. He said. She reached out and traced her finger along his lips. I don't need a reason to see my fiancé Damien. She wrapped her arms around his neck before leaning in and intertwining her lips with his. I suddenly began to feel a pang in my heart seeing them so close to each other. I took my eyes away from them, centering it on something. Why I am feeling this way. Why? Do I also feel the need to obey her? I should just let her know I am not a maid and save myself from this torture. Who else is in the room? Damien spoke up all of a sudden and I felt my breath lodged itself in my throat. The maid. Kim answered nonchalantly. Amelia? I cleared my throat before answering. Yes. What are? He was about to say something but Kim thankfully interrupted. It's just the maid, Damien. No need to get snappy, she said, sending a distasteful glare my way. She's not a maid, he said. At this moment one would assume he's defending me, but I should know better. Really? She uttered, her eyes dripping with curiosity now. She stood up and slowly made her way towards me. Who then are you? She asked. I am. I was about to speak but Damien cut in. Amelia is Lucas's girlfriend. He lied. Ha. She let out like she was not quite believing the story. Funny, I didn't know Lucas Reed had a girlfriend. Chapter 19. Amelia. You look beautiful. Lucas whispered with a smile. Thank you. I replied shyly. The party has been held in a large hall in the house and it's breathtakingly beautiful, especially the guests. Beautiful famous people occupied the room. The women were glittering with their elegant fancy dresses and diamonds that were hanging off their wrists, necks, and ears. The men were on dashing tuxedos that resembled something that was fetched out of a magazine cover. Lucas stood by my side the whole time. Whenever someone greets me he would introduce me as his friend with a smile. All the guests were extremely friendly and not once did they make me feel inferior to them. They made me feel like I belonged to this part of the world. I took my eyes around the room. Something wasn't quite right. Where's Damien? I whispered to Lucas as he handed me a glass of champagne, which I politely declined while waiting for his response. He sipped his champagne before replying. He can't be here. He said. Not only did his words stun me but they as well confused me. Why? I asked. He stayed silent for a moment, his eyes wandering around the room before he turned them back to me. Because anyone in this room might have wanted him dead. He answered and took another sip of his wine. That made sense. Suddenly the sound of a glass clicking caught everyone's attention and all heads turned in unison to the stage where Mrs. Gray was standing with a satisfied smile on her face. On behalf of my family and we would like to thank you all for being here with us tonight. Few minutes later, after a few long minutes, she ended the speech and everyone applauded. The rest of the night was spent taking pictures. Lucas and I posed for several photos together and it's now time for the dance. I had been silently praying for Lucas not to ask me for a dance because I happened to be a terrible dancer and thankfully one of the guests came and took him away to discuss business. I like your dress. A voice spoke up. I turned to see Kim in a fancy sparkly dress. Thank you. I whispered. Amelia, right? She asked. I simply nodded. Amelia, I wanted to apologize for how rude I was towards you the last time. She started. I cut in before she could continue. It's all forgotten, I said and managed to muster up a smile, but before she could say anything else Lucas popped in. Dance with me? He said, and without even lifting her a glance or waiting for my response he held my hand and pulled me towards the middle of the room. Ignore her, she's just searching for attention, he said. I turned my eyes back to her and noticed she was watching us carefully. Weird. Lucas held tightly to my hand as Bruno Mars's 24K Magic began to play on the loud stereo, making everyone chant with excitement. Before we start, I happen to be a very terrible dancer and those shoes seem very expensive, I warned, making him grin. He leans closer to my ear. Me too, he whispers, making me smile uncontrollably. I feel very happy surrounded by these people, especially Lucas, even knowing if it were in a different circumstance they won't even spare me a glance. Did you have fun? Lucas asked as he walked me to my room. It was nighttime, the sun has already gone to rest and the moon is taking its place, hanging out brightly in the sky. Yes, I replied softly. Silence surrounded us for a moment as we strode along the now empty hallway that leads to my room. When was your last relationship? He asked curiously. A year ago. What happened? He asked. My mind lingered to my last relationship. My ex-boyfriend Michael was like a lava lamp. He had all these high emotions that made him so attractive. They tumbled about, taking their turn to rise and fall. But when it's all said and done, they really don't get him anywhere. It just wasn't working, I replied. He nodded understanding. What about you? I chirped in instantly before he had the chance to ask me any more questions. You must have millions of girls falling at your feet. Chapter 20. Amelia. I've been standing for almost 30 minutes turning and trying to catch a better glimpse of myself in the mirror. I happen to be visiting my parents today and there shouldn't be any signs or suspicions that I am pregnant or they would both flip on me. I let out a light sigh as I heard a knock on the door. Come in, I mumbled. The door opened and I turned to see who it was. Shockingly, it was Kim. Suddenly I felt the air get stuck in my chest. I haven't seen her since the party and I assumed she had left. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, shutting the door behind her. I shook my head. I wasn't expecting you, I uttered. You know, Amelia, I've been thinking a lot lately, she said, stepping closer to me. How Damien was defending you last time and how up until that day I wasn't aware Lucas had a girlfriend. Then suddenly it all made perfect sense. I gulped. What are you talking about? I rumbled. She took her eyes down to my stomach. You're the surrogate, she said, and my heart almost popped out of my chest. I don't know why, but something about her frightens me. You knew? I managed to utter. She chuckled. Of course I knew. I gathered the semen from Damien myself for Mrs. Gray. She knew Damien would be totally against it and I clearly wasn't ready to have a child yet. She walked over to the bed and sat down. I gasped at her words. How could she easily betray him like that? How far along are you? She asked. A month, I whispered. If it's any consolation, you don't look a day pregnant, she said, sounding a little nice, but I am obviously not going to fall for it. What do you want, Kim? I shot, and she walked over to the door and checked if there was anyone listening before locking it and turning back to me. I could feel my legs starting to get numb as I pictured different scenarios of things she could possibly do to me or my baby. I swallowed thickly. What do you want? Calm down, Amelia. I would never hurt you or your baby, she said, as if reading my mind. I just want us to talk. She said calmly, "You know, I used to be just like you, naive and carefree. I had a happy life before this, but like you I wanted more. I was greedy for more. Then I met Damien. He promised me money, fame, luxury, pretty much everything I had desired, but only if I agreed to get engaged to him. At the time he wanted to prove to his company highest investors that he was fit and capable to properly handle their shares. At the time I also knew Damien wouldn't be capable of love or even anything slightly close to it, but I accepted it anyway. A year after our engagement I began to feel trapped and suffocated. I was no longer free like I was used to. I wanted to get out but Damien won't let me. That's when I met Danish Rob. He happens to be one of the Greys' archest enemy. He told me everything about the Greys and all their secrets, and he promised me a better way out of it. All I had to do was get a confession or evidence, anything that would help put down the Greys once and for all. I accepted and I've been working undercover for him since then." She finished and I almost lost my breath in shock. "You're using Damien?" I breathed out, almost choking out of my words. How could she do this to him? How could you? What about Lucas? I hurled. How could you betray him like that? I choked out. I loved Lucas. She argued, but I couldn't get the life I desired with him. She got up and moved closer to me. "Trust me, this has nothing to do with him or you." She reached out and rubbed my hand. "Amelia, you know more than anyone how horrible the Greys are, especially Mrs. Grey. She would ruin you and everything you hold dear if you don't beat her to it first." Her expression were scaring me. She seemed like a psychopath. "Danish has promised to protect you and your child only if you agree to help him pull down the Greys." At her words I jolted her hands off mine. "You're crazy." I spat bitterly. "I would never bend down to your level." How could she do this to Damien, especially knowing everything he's been through? He's willing to protect